Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into John C. Lilly, the Cold War neurophysiologist who mapped human consciousness through sensory deprivation, dolphin communication, and radical self-experimentation. And I think we really have to start by completely dismantling the popular mythology around this guy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you hear the name John C. Lilly, you probably picture, some 1960s counterculture guru wrapped up in psychedelic folklore.
Right, the whole tight-eye aesthetic.
Yeah, exactly. But that image entirely obscures what he was actually doing. I mean, we are taking a deep dive into the life of a rigorous medical doctor, a precision engineer with a Caltech pedigree who, above all else, demanded empirical data.
And the stakes of that research were incredibly high. Like, he built the very first isolation tank in the 1950s to map the human mind. But, well, the immediate result was the American national security state knocking on his door.
Right, looking to weaponize it.
Exactly. They wanted to find the absolute breaking point of human psychology. And this tension between a government looking for a weapon and a lone scientist looking for the mind's generative capacity, that's the core of his story.
It really is the defining tension of his entire life. The military apparatus saw isolation as a tool for destruction, specifically for Project MKUltra.
Yeah.
But Lilly saw it as an instrument for absolute cognitive freedom. And, his refusal to surrender his technology to the CIA initiated this whole trajectory that pushed him out of mainstream academia entirely.
He just followed his data, right?
He did. He pursued it into territories that cost him his career, his marriages, his fortune. Yet, his underlying architectural theories of the brain quietly became the foundation for modern neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and, of course, the massive commercial flotation therapy industry.
So to understand how he even had the leverage to defy the intelligence community in the first place, we have to look at his genealogical foundation. I mean, he was born in 1915 in St. Paul, Minnesota, into a highly affluent banking family.
Yes, and that wealth is not just a biographical footnote.
Right, it's structural.
Exactly. It's the mechanism that insulated him from the institutional funding pressures that force most researchers into compliance. He had this financial autonomy that gave him an incredible degree of intellectual defiance later on.
And that independence was compounded by his academic conditioning. Like when he got to Caltech in 1933, he was trained by physicists and biologists who were literally defining modern empirical science.
Yeah, he studied under Thomas Hunt Morgan for biology and Robert Andrews Millikan for physics, both Nobel laureates. And they operated on this strict mandate: if you cannot measure it physically, it just does not exist.
Which Lilly deeply internalized. By the time he finished his medical degree at the University of Penn in 1942, he viewed the human body strictly as a biological machine operating under the laws of physics.
And that mechanical view drops him right into the middle of World War II biophysics at the Johnson Foundation for Medical Physics.
Right, where he's analyzing extreme altitude survival.
Yes, specifically, explosive decompression for aviation medicine. He needed to know exactly what happens to the cardiovascular system at 40,000 feet.
But the tools at the time couldn't measure real-time dynamic changes, right? Unless you cut a person open.
Exactly. So, operating as a pure engineer, Lilly just invents a new instrument. It's the electrical capacitance diaphragmometer U.S. patent 2447817A.
Wow, even the patent number.
Yeah, well, instead of looking at static numbers, this device used electrical capacitance to measure continuous, real-time blood pressure changes without arterial invasion. It became a standard aviation medicine tool.
That invention is so crucial because it shows his obsession with observing dynamic systems in motion. And it was during these high-altitude decompression studies that he has this major aha moment. He starts observing how the central nervous system behaves under catastrophic stress.
Right, and he recognizes a fundamental operational requirement of the human brain. It relies on constant, uninterrupted sensory input from the external world just to maintain a coherent model of reality.
Let's contextualize just how radical his thinking was here. The mainstream consensus in the 1940s and 50s was that the brain was essentially a passive receiver.
Yeah, completely.
To use an analogy, they treated the brain like a radio. They believed it needed an external, broadcast-like sensory data to produce any sound. If you shut off the broadcast, the radio goes silent and the brain simply powers down into sleep.
But Lilly looks at his data and argues the exact opposite.
Right. He says the brain is not a radio, it's a film projector, and the internal generator never stops running. So the question he poses is, what exactly happens when you put a cap over the projector lens?
That is the perfect way to phrase it. He hypothesized that the brain has intrinsic self-sustaining energy. The constant flood of external sensory data, sight, sound, gravity, actually acts as a constraint. It takes up massive amounts of computational power.
So if you shut that off.
The generator doesn't turn off. Freed from processing the outside world, the brain's processing power accelerates and turns entirely inward. And he takes this hypothesis to the National Institute of Mental Health in 1953 to prove it.
Right, contrasting the mainstream view that a deprived brain just sleeps, which means he has to build a machine capable of literally erasing the physical world.
Enter the 1954 isolation tank.
Yes, built in Bethesda, Maryland. And the engineering specifications were totally uncompromising. He wasn't using the shallow Epsom salt baths we see today. This was a vertical tank of deep, fresh water.
And the temperature was locked precisely at 93 degrees Fahrenheit.
Exactly, because that's the exact point where the water becomes indistinguishable from human skin temperature, erasing the body's thermal boundary.
Right, and he designed a complete blackout mask that enclosed the entire head, supplying air through a tube. The room was utterly light-proof, heavily soundproofed, and suspending a person vertically in the water functionally negated gravity.
And he acts as his own primary subject. He stays submerged for hours, and the mechanical data vindicates his theory perfectly. The mind did not go to sleep.
No, not at all. Deprived of the external world, the brain begins projecting its own complex internal theater. Three-dimensional spatial environments, simulated auditory and visual inputs, and they felt indistinguishable from waking reality.
He proved consciousness is an active generative structure. When you remove the external world, the mind just builds a new one from its own architecture. And he publishes these findings in 1956.
And the moment that data hits the public record, the CIA arrives.
Of course they do. It's the height of the Cold War. Project MKUltra is actively hunting for psychological manipulation methods. They look at a machine that severs a human being from reality and immediately think weapon.
They wanted to use it to break a prisoner's mind for interrogation. They asked him to turn over his research.
And he flatly refused. But, I mean, the dark irony here is striking, right? The military saw isolation and instantly thought weapon, while Lilly saw freedom.
Exactly.
But how does a government-funded researcher at NIMH actually escape the military apparatus in the 1950s? You can't just politely decline the CIA and go back to your desk.
No, you have to make yourself structurally useless to their operational objectives. That was his strategic pivot. He realized as long as he was studying human isolation, the military considered his work an asset.
So he intentionally selects a subject so far outside military operational interests that they couldn't possibly follow him or weaponize it.
Precisely. He abandons human testing and pivots entirely to marine mammals, specifically bottlenose dolphins or Tursiops truncatus.
Right. And by 1959, he establishes the Communication Research Institute on St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. He designed this incredible flooded floor lab.
And because of his impeccable scientific pedigree, he secures massive funding. The National Science Foundation, the Office of Naval Research, and remarkably, NASA.
Which is such a fascinating detail. NASA wasn't funding him out of some sudden passion for marine biology.
No, not at all.
They were actively preparing to encounter non-human intelligence in space. They viewed dolphins as an accessible analog for an alien mind. If Lilly could establish communication protocols with the species separated from us by 50 million years of evolution, NASA wanted that blueprint.
And he approached the dolphins exactly as he approached the high-altitude data, through rigorous measurement. He didn't just listen to them, he mapped their vocalizations physically, using high-speed magnetic tape and sound spectrographs.
To analyze their acoustic architecture.
Yes. And he discovers they possess a highly structured acoustic capability. Most surprisingly, he found they were intentionally pitching their vocalizations up into the human hearing range to attempt cross-species communication.
Which leads to his 1961 bestseller, Man and Dolphin, and eventually culminates in the infamous 1965 Living In experiment.
Right, with Margaret Howe Lovatt.
Yeah, she was a researcher at his lab, and she spent 6 days a week for months living in 18 inches of seawater, continuously cohabitating with a male dolphin named Peter.
The methodology was to completely immerse Peter in human language and map how he adjusted his blowhole musculature to mimic the cadence of Lovatt's speech.
And they gathered incredibly precise linguistic data, but the experiment collapsed under biological realities. Peter reached sexual maturity, his behavior became aggressive, and the whole dynamic just became unmanageable.
And the media seized on the sensationalism of an isolated young woman living with a sexually mature dolphin. The scientific establishment, which was already skeptical, began withdrawing funding.
So, with the institutional walls closing in, Lilly makes an incredibly radical decision. He takes his deep knowledge of neurochemistry, utilizes a legal research license from NIMH, and introduces Sandoz LSD-25 into the lab.
Yes, to both the dolphins and himself.
Right. He administers it to the dolphins to analyze the impact on their acoustic output, and he takes it himself while suspended inside the isolation tank. Now, giving LSD to dolphins sounds like absolute madness on the surface, but functionally, looking at this through his lens as an engineer, was he just trying to force a hard reboot on their biological computers to access the underlying code?
That is the exact theoretical framework driving the decision. By the 60s, Lilly was heavily into cybernetic theories. He viewed the brain as a complex computer running habitual software programs.
Okay.
The isolation tank physically removed the external hardware inputs. Right. So the LSD was introduced specifically to disrupt the internal software, the habitual ingrained programs governing perception and communication.
Strip away the filter.
Exactly. He theorized that if you eliminate both the sensory noise and the software filter simultaneously, you access the raw, unfiltered processing signal beneath the noise.
And this transitions us right into what's frequently called his ketamine decade. He meets Craig Enright, a chemist at the Esalen Institute, who introduces him to ketamine hydrochloride, which Lilly called vitamin K.
And he approaches this with the exact same clinical precision he used on the aviation manometer. It wasn't recreational.
No, it was a highly documented, intense regimen. He was injecting 50 to 100 milligrams every hour for consecutive days while suspended in the isolation tank.
The pharmacological mechanism of ketamine is critical here. It's an anesthetic dissociative. Unlike classical psychedelics, it disrupts the chemical signals between the conscious mind and the physical body.
Severing conscious awareness from the physical form without putting him to sleep.
Right. Inside the sensory void of the tank, this allowed him to observe his own mental architecture with total detachment. And he codified these observations in his 1967 manual, Programming and Metaprogramming, in the Human Biocomputer.
Which is such a dense, fascinating text. He strips away all the mystical terminology usually associated with altered states and uses purely computational language. He defines the mind as a self-programming computer.
And introduces the concept of the metaprogrammer.
Yeah. So decades before the tech boom, he was conceptualizing human consciousness as an operating system. And he was basically using the tank and ketamine to grant himself admin privileges to rewrite his own neural code.
Yes, and what's remarkable is that modern neuroscience has completely validated this cybernetic model. What Lilly termed metaprogramming is precisely what contemporary cognitive science identifies as high-order neuroplasticity.
Wow.
When modern cognitive behavioral therapy works to achieve schema-level change, rewriting the fundamental assumptions a patient holds about reality, they are executing exactly what Lilly described.
That's incredible. But the insights he pulled from these states ultimately shattered his academic credibility. Emerging from these intense ketamine sessions, he developed the Earth Coincidence Control Office hypothesis, or ECCO.
Right, which he presented as an empirical observation of hierarchical control systems guiding human development.
Yeah, he argued that if the human mind is a computer running on a specific level, and you elevate your consciousness above your programming, you inevitably encounter the broader operating systems governing the universe.
And when he published these conclusions in his 1978 autobiography, the scientists, his peers, entirely dismissed him. They just couldn't reconcile his engineering brilliance with his conclusions about cosmic hierarchies.
But while academia shunned him, modern science eventually caught up to his original 1954 thesis about what the tank actually does. I mean, the isolation tank has seen a massive resurgence lately, largely popularized by people like Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
And Rogan's lay explanation that you separate from the senses so the brain stops listening to the body's constant noise, that connects directly back to Lilly's computational problem.
It's a perfect distillation. And we now have functional MRI data that maps exactly how this works. When you enter sensory isolation, the brain's default mode network doesn't slow down.
That's the system responsible for self-referential processing, right?
Exactly. Internal narrative memory. In the tank, it becomes hyperactive. It produces these massive new functional connections, inducing chemical-free psychedelic states. The neuroimaging completely validates his assertion that the isolated brain builds its own reality.
But before we get too deep into his legacy, we really have to confront the tragedy that ended his dolphin research. By 1968, the lab collapses. Funding is gone. He releases some dolphins, but Peter is moved to a small, dark holding tank in Miami.
Stripped of stimulation and human contact.
And this creates a profound biological crisis because, unlike humans, dolphins are voluntary breathers.
Right. Every single respiration requires a conscious neurological command. And in that holding tank, Peter swam to the bottom, closed his blowhole, and simply refused to send the command to surface. He deliberately committed suicide.
And we really have to emphasize the philosophical weight of that moment for Lilly. He spent years proving these were intelligent, self-aware beings, which means he had to interpret Peter's death as a conscious, calculated choice against captivity. That must have absolutely shattered him.
It did. The toll it took was immense. The subsequent decades reflect that fracture. His 3 failed marriages, his drained fortune, he spent the 70s fiercely advocating against marine mammal captivity.
And he tried to launch the Janus Project, right?
Yes, early translation tech for dolphin communication, but the computing power just wasn't there yet, and it failed. Then in 1974, he has a near-fatal bicycle crash while under the influence of ketamine, resulting in a coma. To fund his life after all this, he resorted to selling samadhi flotation tanks directly to the public.
And he dies in 2001 at 86, basically in financial ruin. But contrast that with the industry today. The modern float industry generates hundreds of millions of dollars. You've got the Patriots, Seahawks, UFC fighters using it. John Lennon famously used the tank in '79 to interrupt the neural pathways of his heroin addiction.
Proving Lilly's theory about disrupting deeply ingrained chemical habits. And beyond commercial applications, modern computational neuroscience operates entirely on his cybernetic model, understanding the brain fundamentally as a prediction engine.
But the most profound scientific vindication is happening right now. The 2026 Cetacean Translation Initiative, or CEEDI, is using machine learning to decode sperm whale and dolphin vocalizations.
Yes, and they're mapping these vocalizations as high-dimensional vector spaces. AI is mathematically proving that their communication possesses complex syntax signature whistles as names, referential language for objects.
Artificial intelligence is finally providing the proof that Lilly hypothesized back in 1960. Which brings us to the Stanford University libraries, where his physical archives are held.
It's an incredible collection. Meticulously kept laboratory notebooks, his letters with cybernetics pioneers like Gregory Bateson and Warren McCulloch.
The cultural artifact that kept his methodology visible was the 1980 film Altered States, but the actual raw data is sitting in those Stanford boxes, including unprocessed original audio tapes of his dolphin research.
Right. So if deep learning AI is only just now proving what he hypothesized in the 1960s, what exactly is sitting in those unprocessed audio tapes at Stanford right now, waiting for our technology to finally catch up to John C. Lilly?
It really forces you to consider the immense personal cost of being structurally ahead of your time. He laid the groundwork for cognitive plasticity and cross-species linguistics, but he absorbed the full penalty of his discoveries alone.
Yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive, synthesize the overarching narrative for yourself. Think about the stark contrast between a state's instinct to weaponize a tool of consciousness and Lilly's choice to explore the mind. Leave some space to ponder Peter's final, deliberate decision at the bottom of that tank. Think about what Lilly actually encountered during his 1974 coma and what untapped secrets are still resting in those Stanford archives. Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.